afternoon, and welcome to the second installment of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the organizer of this lecture series. Again, I want to thank Paul Sawyer Public Library and Community Services Librarian Diane Dehoney for hosting us today, and to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for recording and broadcasting this series. Our first lecture from October, featuring Jessica Stavros on Liberty Hall and Robert Burns Wilson, can be found on Cable 10's YouTube channel, along with some of the lectures of the previous historic Frankfort lecture series, which was the inspiration for this series. Beginning in February, our lectures will occur on the second Saturday of the month at 1 p.m., and you can keep up with our schedule on frankfortheritageweek.com, on the Frankfort Heritage Week or Paul Sawyer Public Library Facebook page, www.pspl.org. You can also watch the lectures after the fact once they are posted to Cable 10's YouTube channel. I'm excited to now announce our lineup for the 2024 spring season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. On February 10th, we will have Keeneland Library Executive Director Rhoda Ferraro present The Heart of the Turf, Racing's Black Pioneers, a now traveling exhibit of Keeneland Library, which is also accompanied by a book by the same name, which Ms. Ferraro will have with her to sell and sign copies. On March 9th, our very own Dr. Richard Lawrence Taylor will present Frankfort and Leestown, how the Taylor family influenced the founding of two pre-Kentucky settlements. On April 13th, researcher and collector of early Kentucky-made furniture, Mac Cox, will present a two-part presentation called Exploring Early Frankfort, Kentucky Furniture and Decorative Inlay in Early Kentucky Furniture. On May 11th, acting director and Kentucky Geological Survey and University of Kentucky geology professor, Dr. William Drew Andrews, will present Oceans, Glaciers, Rivers, and Caves, How the Rocks Under Our Feet Help Make Frankfort Unique. And finally, on June 8th, Historic Preservation Coordinator Tressa Brown of the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission and the Kentucky Heritage Council will present the first in a two-part series on our region's Native American history. Ms. Brown's presentation will be entitled American Indian Communities in Kentucky. So mark these on your calendars and pick up a copy of the schedule in the back to put on your refrigerator so you don't miss this great lecture series. I came across our presenter today in a very serendipitous manner. I really wanted our first lectures of the series to be special, to focus on aspects of the founding of our town, to highlight our incredible state and national celebrities, and to be related to our upcoming America 250 efforts. I thought, what better subject than the story of General James Wilkinson, our city's founder, who laid out the streets of Frankfort and named them for his friends and colleagues, including Ann Street, named for his wife, Nancy Ann Biddle Wilkinson. Miro, named for Spanish governor of Louisiana and Florida, Esteban Rodriguez Miro y Sabater, and St. Clair, named for Major General Arthur St. Clair, under whom Wilkinson served in the Continental Army. Many of us historians and lovers of Frankfort history are also aware of Andrew Linklater's 2009 book, Artist in Treason, The Extraordinary Double Life of General James Wilkinson. Unfortunately, Mr. Linklater passed in 2013, but my Google searches were not unsuccessful. I learned that earlier in the summer of this year, a new book on General James Wilkinson was published by Georgetown University Press, the book by today's presenter, American Traitor. I was very excited to learn of this book because while Linklater's comprehensively covered Wilkinson's life, American Traitor was billed as the first book to focus on Wilkinson's crimes and his trial for treason at Fredericktown. And given the author's military, legal, and investigative background, I thought, what better author could you have to research and write this book? I reached out to Georgetown University Press and was put in touch with Mr. Cox, and the rest is history. We're very excited to have him today. I want to provide, for those of you that don't know, a little context as to how James Wilkinson came to be involved in the founding of Frankfort. In July, we commemorated the 250th anniversary of the first survey of Frankfort by Hancock Taylor. Those ceremonies can also be found on YouTube. Hancock Taylor was then deputy surveyor of Fincastle County, Virginia, of which the land of Frankfort was then a part. He served under official surveyor of Fincastle County, Colonel William Preston, the uncle of John Brown of Liberty Hall, who was responsible for Kentucky statehood and would become Kentucky's first United States senator. After his death in 1774, Hancock Taylor would become the uncle of the 12th President of the United States, Zachary Taylor, who plays a role in the story of Wilkinson's life that we're about to hear. When Hancock Taylor surveyed Frankfort in 1773, he was traveling with the McAfee Company, made up of explorer Robert McAfee, his two brothers, James and George, his brother-in-law, James McCown Jr., and a young Samuel Clark Adams. Hancock's survey of Frankfort was performed at the request of Robert McAfee. Unfortunately, Robert never registered his survey with the Virginia Land Office. Many years later, while performing research for a client at the Virginia Land Office, attorney Humphrey Marshall discovered that Robert McAfee's survey was not registered and proceeded to register it himself. For those that don't know, Marshall later wrote one of the first histories of Kentucky and later resided at Glen Willis on Wilkinson Boulevard, now occupied by Limewater Restaurant. When Robert McAfee learned that his survey had been registered by Humphrey Marshall, he sued Marshall at the Virginia Chancery Court. The court later ruled that McAfee had neglected to properly register the survey and awarded ownership of the survey to Humphrey Marshall, who then, within 3 weeks of the court's ruling, in October of 1786, turned around and sold it to a young James Wilkinson, who had been separated from the Continental Army and had been living in Lexington since 1783. Marshall, along with future Kentucky Governor Isaac Shelby, Senator John Brown of Liberty Hall, and Judge Harry Ennis, were on a list of over 20 people that Wilkinson had submitted to Spanish Governor Miro, suggesting who should be recruited to the Spanish conspiracy and placed on the Spanish payroll. Humphrey Marshall was also one of the first people to alert the federal government of Wilkins' treachery, accusing him of causing the death of Colonel John Hardin, father of Martin D. Hardin, one of the first residents of Wareland, which we now call Scotland Farm today. No doubt trying to seize upon the newly established trade route on the Kentucky and Ohio rivers, Wilkinson took the survey he purchased from Humphrey Marshall and petitioned the Virginia legislature to establish a town called Frankfort. Prior to this, Frankfort had been known as Frank's Ford as a result of explorer Stephen Frank having been killed in 1770 by natives during an attack that took place just down the street from us at a ford near the mouth of Benson Creek at the Kentucky River. The Virginia legislature granted Wilkinson's petition on October 6, 1786, and Frankfort was thus established. Perhaps there can be found some saving grace that up to the point of founding Frankfort, Wilkinson had not yet committed the treachery against the Republic and had served the fledgling United States military honorably. Frankfort was not founded by a traitor. It was founded by a young man who, as we will see, would later become the highest-ranking official ever tried for treason and perhaps the most dangerous traitor in American history, perhaps surpassing that of Benedict Arnold, providing us with a cautionary tale that has relevance to issues facing our republic today. And with that, I give you Community Services Librarian of Paul Sawyer Public Library, Diane Dehoney, to present our highly esteemed speaker today.
Thank you, John. And thank you all for being here today. As he said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian here at Paul Sawyer. And on behalf of the library, we just want to welcome you all. Thanks for being here on kind of a dreary day, but what better day to be in here and learning about our wonderful city's history. All right, so without further ado, I am so proud to welcome our speaker today. Howard W. Cox is a retired member of the Senior Intelligence Service of the Central Intelligence Agency. During his 40-year career as a federal government employee, Howard served as a cyber crimes prosecutor with the Department of Justice and as an attorney and criminal investigator with the Department of Defense, the General Services Administration, and the U.S. Postal Service. He also served as staff counsel to the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Prior to his civilian service, he was a trial attorney with the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. He is a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center and Seton Hall University. Please help me to welcome the author of American Traitor, Howard W. Cox.
Thank you, everyone. And first, I would like to thank both John and Diane for the wonderful hospitality they've shown here. I've never been to Frankfort before. I spent very little time in Kentucky, and then a wonderful job showing me the sites, showing me the Wilkinson sites, and allowing me to get a much better picture of what this community is all about. As I indicated, I haven't had much connection with Kentucky at all. My great-grandfather was born in Louisville. I pronounced that correctly, right? Louisville? Okay. And my eldest son was married in Bowling Green. But Kentucky was responsible for the single most important snap decision I ever made in my life. Many of you might be able to point to a single moment where you made a quick decision and your whole life changed as a result of that. Well, that decision affected me, and it affected because of Kentucky. So when I got out of law school, I had been in ROTC during college, during the Vietnam War. I had some military time. And so I decided to join the Army and try to be assigned where I can do trial work. And so I went down to the Pentagon and I met with a recruiter, and he says, you want to go to Fort Knox, Kentucky. That's where you want to go. There's trials galore there. You want to go to Fort Knox. There's a lot worse places than Fort Knox to be assigned in the U.S. Army. So I said, count me in. And so I go to the Army JAG school down in Charlottesville, Virginia, down there for 3 solid months. And the week before graduation, some colonel comes down from the Pentagon, and he says, Cox and Jones and Thompson, the 3 people in the class that were supposed to go to Fort Knox, you need to see me in the back of the classroom right away. So we go up, he says, okay, Colonel, what's up? He says, we don't need anybody at Fort Knox. So you guys can go to one of 3 other places. One of them is Fort Meade, Maryland. Another one is Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And the third one was Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So he says, you guys fight it out and tell me what you want. So as he turns to leave, I make the snap decision that changed my entire life. Before he even gets out the door, I say, Colonel, Fort Meade was my second choice. He says, okay, Cox, you've got Meade. You other 2 guys fight out who goes to Fort Leonard Wood, who goes to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. They, of course, never spoke to me again for the rest of the class. I never heard from them. But as a result of that, that's where I met my wife. That's where I made a variety of career decisions. It was the most important snap decision I ever made in my life, but I've regretted the opportunity of not being able to explore Kentucky, so this has been a great opportunity to come here. Why James Wilkinson? Okay, one of the reasons I've tripped on Wilkinson or dealt with Wilkinson was undergraduate, I was a history major. I loved history, and I still love history to this day. And so as I pursued my legal career, because with all due respect to professional historians, you can't make a living writing history, I decided to become a lawyer. But I always had a love of history as a result of that. So I'm assigned to Fort Meade, and I'm prosecuting, or defending rather, corporals and privates. I think, does anybody ever court-martial a senior officer? Who is the highest ranking official ever to be a court-martialed by the U.S. Army? It was James Wilkinson. Put that aside. When I'm working at the Defense Department Inspector General's office investigating contract fraud, I was wondering, who was the highest ranking DOD official ever to be accused of contract fraud? It was James Wilkinson. And then when I worked at the Central Intelligence Agency, the question was, who's the highest ranking official in the federal government ever to be charged with being a spy? It's James Wilkinson. Excuse me. So when I retired, I moved to Frederick, Maryland, which is where Wilkinson got court-martialed. And I said, Judge, there's just too many coincidences here. I need to write a book about James Wilkinson. So this is the first book I've ever written. It was a labor of love. It took about 6 years to complete. Researching books when COVID was on was an interesting proposition. You couldn't get into libraries. You couldn't get into universities. You couldn't get into the National Archives, the Library of Congress. And so much of the research I had to do online, as well as reaching out to librarians that were working there that were willing to run things down for me so that I could write a sufficiently historically based book that would be, and the goal here was I wanted this thing to pass peer review. I wanted professional historians to take a look at this book and say, yes, this has been professionally written and professionally researched. And I'm very grateful for Georgetown University Press for giving me that opportunity. So let's talk a little bit about Wilkinson and what he did and who he was. We talk about who's the greater traitor. Everybody knows Benedict Arnold, okay? Most infamous traitor in US history. His name is synonymous with treason, okay? For absolutely legitimate reasons. But up until he turned coat and worked for the British, he was the finest combat commander in the Revolutionary War. He was better than any other general, and that's the subject for another discussion we'll talk a little bit about here. But in 1776 and 1777, Benedict Arnold saved the United States and repeatedly defeated British invasions of the United States. And it was truly a tragedy that he ultimately chose to become a traitor. Okay, so we all know Benedict Arnold. The difference between him and Wilkinson is he had a great military record. Wilkinson did not, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Another traitor, Robert Hanssen, senior FBI official, spied for the Russians for years and years and years. He passed away recently at a Supermax prison in Colorado in June of this year. But he probably is the most infamous traitor in our current lifetime right now of compromising numerous CIA and FBI operations and getting numerous sources that the Bureau and the CIA had recruited in Russia and having those people executed. Okay, he also earned over $1 million from the Russians. And as we'll point out a little bit later on, Wilkinson almost made that much money from his time as being a spy. So Wilkinson is one of the best paid spies in US history. Hanssen is probably the best paid spy. So we all know about Benedict Arnold. We all know about Robert Hanssen. James Wilkinson. Many, many people here are familiar with Wilkinson because of his background in founding this city. Most people in other parts of the country don't know about Wilkinson and are just delighted that they don't know about him and want to forget him. Okay, the U.S. Army doesn't make any mention of Wilkinson until they're forced to in many of their historical backgrounds. He was obviously a founding father of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He was the commanding general of the U.S. Army. For the first 40 years of the U.S. Army, he served as the commanding general longer than anybody else. He was a paid agent of Spain from 1787 to 1805, received over $1 million in today's money, which is a significant sum of money for spies. He was a co-conspirator with Aaron Burr, and we'll talk a little bit about that because part of that took place here in Kentucky. In one peacetime operation that he screwed up, he killed over 1/4 of the entire United States Army that died of malnutrition or disease because of his neglect and because of his corruption. And we'll talk about that as well. And then as one historian said, and I wish I had said this, but some other historian beat me to it, he was a general who never won a battle and never lost a court-martial. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. A little bit of his background. Wilkinson was a Marylander. He grew up in a plantation society, a tobacco plantation society in Calvert County, Maryland. He was the third son, so he wasn't going to inherit anything from his father. So the thought was, you need to become a doctor. And so he shipped off at the time to the only medical school in the United States which existed in Philadelphia. And he studied there for a number of years. And he decided, I've had enough. I know enough to practice medicine. And he leaves the medical school in Philadelphia and goes to Frederick County, Maryland, in a community he knew nothing about, where mostly they spoke German that Wilkinson didn't understand, and decides he's going to become a doctor there. The month he arrives in Maryland is the month that Lexington and Concord took place, April 1775. And so Wilkinson decides, I want to be a soldier. Forget about this medicine stuff. I want to be a soldier. So in Frederick, Maryland, right where he was living, they were raising 2 ranger companies of people who were going to be tough backwoodsmen and go out and help Washington fight Indians. And he decides, it's a little too rough for my tastes, and decides instead to go all the way down to Georgetown, which was right outside Washington, D.C., and join a social regiment there that had connections to George Washington and a variety of local businessmen that were there. Okay? When he doesn't get elected to an office or position with that regiment, he decides he's going to go on his own money up to Boston and join the Continental Army. And so he joins there, and eventually he was able to talk his way into a commission with the New Hampshire Regiment. And so now he is a second lieutenant as an officer with the Continental Army. Because he was an educated man of letters, he was an attractive candidate to become a staff officer with a broad variety of generals that were there. And so he served on the staff of a number of individuals, but he decided, I need to get some field command time, and goes back to his regiment, who are transferred to Canada to assist the American Army who had invaded Canada the year before. And so Wilkinson travels with his regiment up to Canada, okay, and joins Benedict Arnold, who is leading a retreat from Canada of American forces that are there. That 30-day period of time when he traveled with his regiment from Boston up to Canada is the only time in Wilkinson's career that he commanded troops until he became the commanding general 20 years later. So he's never heard a shot fired in anger. He's never directed anybody in a battle. He's never withstood enemy fire. He commanded troops for 30 days, marching from Boston on up to outside Montreal. Benedict Arnold recognizes Wilkinson as somebody who could be a good staff officer, and Wilkinson joins Benedict Arnold. And they are the last 2 American soldiers to leave Canada with the American Army as it retreats out of Canada. Benedict Arnold goes up to Wilkinson as the 2 of them are about to get on a boat. He tells Wilkinson, shoot your horse, because we don't want to leave any of our horses behind for the British to get. So both Arnold and Wilkinson shoot their horses. He gets on the boat and travels with Arnold then back down to Fort Ticonderoga. And so when he gets down to Fort Ticonderoga, he meets a higher-ranking general, Horatio Gates. And Wilkinson decides, hey, I can work with Gates and work on his staff because he's a higher-ranking individual, and I will probably get a higher-ranking position as a result of working for Horatio Gates. Now, Horatio Gates is an interesting character himself. Gates was a former British Army major who decided to leave the British Army and join the American Army. And Washington recognized his administrative talents and made him the adjutant general of the Continental Army. Gates wanted to be a combat commander, and so as a general officer, he commences scheming to replace the commanding general of the Northern Army with himself. And so the thing that Gates mostly did during his military career was scheme. In 1776 and 77, he's trying to undercut Philip Schuyler as the commanding general of the Northern Army. And then in 1777, 1778, he's scheming to replace George Washington as the commanding general of the entire Continental Army. So for the most part, Gates is known as a schemer, and that, in my opinion, is where Wilkinson picked up his propensity for engaging in scheming, because his mentor acted that way and showed him how to do it. And we'll show how he was successful and ultimately how they both failed in doing something like this. So he joins Gates in the Northern Army, and one of the people that Gates is scheming with to replace George Washington is the second-ranking general in the Continental Army, Charles Lee. Charles Lee also is a former British Army officer who decided he wanted to fight for the Americans, and so he's the number 2 ranking official. And so in 1776, Washington is driven out of New York, he's driven out of New Jersey, and he takes the army over into Pennsylvania and wants to go ahead then and invade New Jersey at the Battle of Trenton. So he calls on Gates, bring your army down from New England. He calls on Lee, bring your army down from New York and join me here so that we can attack the British at Trenton and Princeton. And both Gates and Lee say, let me think about it. Now, they've both been given an order, join me, and they decide, let me think about it. And so they slowly make their way down, but there's correspondence going back and forth between the two of them saying, hey, we need to get rid of George Washington. Let's put Charles Lee as the commanding general of the Continental Army. And so the person carrying communications back and forth between Lee and Gates is James Wilkinson. And so one night in December of 1776, Wilkinson is told, go find Lee and deliver this letter from Gates. He finds Lee in an inn away from his troops. And why was Lee away from his troops? He's spending the night with a prostitute. And so as he's enjoying himself with a prostitute, Wilkinson comes in and Lee tells him, grab a spot by the fire, I'll see you in the morning. And so the morning he gives this letter then to Charles Lee, and Wilkinson looks out the window and says, the British are here. The house has been surrounded by British dragoons. And they learn where Lee was, and they're going to capture Lee. And so as they break into the house to capture Lee, Wilkinson hides up the chimney. And so they carry out Lee, and Wilkinson now has to go report back to General Gates, hey, your co-conspirator here was just captured by the British, and Gates decides, probably I'm going to have to side with Washington. So eventually the two of them join up with Washington at the Delaware River for the purpose of invading Trenton. Gates, now he is the number 2 person in the army right now. He deserts the army. He doesn't want Washington to succeed, so he goes down to Baltimore to meet with Congress to lobby to replace Washington. Washington crosses the Delaware without him. Wilkinson crosses the Delaware with George Washington. And it is with George Washington and Arthur St. Clair when they successfully win the Battle of Trenton. The following week, Washington takes his army up to Princeton, New Jersey, and they again defeat the British at Princeton, New Jersey. One of the things that happened in Princeton was Alexander Hamilton was an artillery captain. And one of the things that he liked to do was shell Princeton University. The British were holed up in Princeton University, and he's shelling them with a particular vigor. Why? He was denied admission into Princeton University. So he's blasting the living daylights out of the campus, and Wilkinson in his memoir says, hey, one of those shots almost accidentally hit me. So Wilkinson now, as a staff aide, he's been promoted to major, okay, but he's never commanded troops, but he decides, I'm going to go back and work with Horatio Gates again, because Gates is back now in 1777 with the goal of dealing with the British on their invasion of the northern portion of the United States. In 1777, the British had a 3-part plan to divide the colonies. Part number 1 was General John Burgoyne would travel down from Montreal, down the Richelieu River, down Lake Champlain, down Lake George, and get to down here to Albany. That would be part number 1. Part number 2 is General Barry St. Leger comes down the St. Lawrence River, through Lake Ontario, and down the Mohawk River, and he's also going to meet Gates here in Albany. I said it was a 3-part plan. Where's the 3rd part? The 3rd part was General William Howe was supposed to come up the Hudson River and meet Burgoyne in Albany. Nobody bothered to coordinate this plan with Howe. He had his own bright ideas. He went after Washington down in Philadelphia. So basically the 3-part plan is only a 2-part plan. And so Benedict Arnold defeats St. Leger here at Fort Stanwix. forces him to go back, and then joins up with Gates and Wilkinson at Saratoga, which becomes the single most important battle in the Revolution. The battles of Saratoga, there was one in September, there was one in October, is the single most important battle in the Revolution. The reason why was when we won that battle, that's what convinced the French to join the United States. And so Wilkinson is an aide to Gates at this particular battle. And unfortunately, at this point, Gates feels that Benedict Arnold is a threat. He's a better commander than Gates, and so therefore, he needs to destroy Arnold and his reputation. And Wilkinson assists Gates in diminishing Arnold's role. But despite their attempts to do that, at the Second Battle of Saratoga, the Battle of Bemis Heights, Benedict Arnold leads the American troops in defeating the British, and in the last moment of the skirmish, he's wounded in one leg, basically destroying his ability to walk, and therefore he's taken off the field as a combat commander, and Gates gets credit for winning the battles of Saratoga because Arnold is in hospital trying to convince surgeons not to cut off his leg. Wilkinson assists Gates in negotiating the terms of surrender. Now at this point, Wilkinson is a 20-year-old lieutenant colonel. Yet he is trusted then to go ahead and negotiate with Burgoyne on the surrender terms. And so the Army surrenders, and as a result of that, Gates recommends a two-step promotion for Wilkinson to be named a brigadier general. And if he gets this promotion, he's going to be the youngest brigadier general, the youngest general officer in the Continental Army, who has all of 30 days commanding troops. Never fired a shot, never commanded in battle, but he is called by Gates the military genius of the Northern Army. And he's sent with to go tell Congress, we won the Battle of Saratoga. He is instructed, tell Congress, don't tell Washington. Because Gates wants to replace Washington as the commanding general of the Continental Army. So he's ignoring Washington. You have nothing to do with me. You have no authority over me. Wilkinson, go tell Congress. And so the problem is Wilkinson slowly makes his way from Saratoga down to York, Pennsylvania. And I'm sorry, let me go back one quick second. This is the famous John Trumbull painting of the surrender at Saratoga. It was painted in 1820. It hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. So one of the things here is that it has all the major historical figures that took part in this particular fight. Obviously, nobody posed for this picture, but he's picking all of the heroes. Who's missing? Benedict Arnold. For two reasons. Number one, Arnold wasn't there. He's fighting with the doctors to keep his leg in the hospital. But secondly, in 1820, he's a notorious traitor. So there's no way you want to indicate that he was present here. So he's completely erased by Trumbull from the painting. Wilkinson is right here. At Gates's elbow right there, that's James Wilkinson. And he legitimately was there. But so he is in this famous John Trumbull painting. So Wilkinson is making his way down to meet with Congress. He's got Gates's endorsement. You're the military genius of the Northern Army. But Gates is already scheming with other generals and with members of Congress to get rid of Washington. And Wilkinson is aware of this because Gates is bragging to Wilkinson as part of his staff, hey, I'm working to get rid of George Washington. So as Wilkinson makes his way down to Congress, he stops over one night at the camp of a general who is a Washington loyalist. And Wilkinson gets drunk that night. And as a result of being drunk, he lets slip, hey, there's this correspondence going on between Horatio Gates and Thomas Conway and General Mifflin and certain members of Congress to get rid of George Washington. And so this general recognizes this and alerts Washington there's a cabal, and it's known in history as the Conway Cabal, of people who are plotting to have you removed as the commanding general of the Continental Army. And Horatio Gates is up to his eyeballs in this conspiracy. So Washington confronts Gates. Gates says, I don't know what you're talking about. He lies. He's confronted again by Washington. He lies again slightly differently. He's confronted a third time, and he says, yes, you're right. There are people who are conspiring to remove you, and those people are James Wilkinson. And so he blames Wilkinson for something that Wilkinson didn't do. He says that, Wilkinson was the guy who headed up this treasonous conspiracy to get rid of you. Wilkinson is now a general officer as a result of Gates, but Gates now throws Wilkinson under the bus. And so when Wilkinson finds out about this, he challenges Gates to a duel. And actually, he challenged him to a duel twice. And so based on my research, this is the only time I can find Wilkinson ever fired a shot in anger. It was at his boss, and he missed. So Washington crushes this cabal. Okay, Washington was a so-so tactician, but as a strategist, he was as a political general, he was outstanding. And he basically gets all these people pushed aside. Yes, sir?
Did this cabal have any legitimate reasons for being opposed to Washington, or just purely greed on their part?
You could sit back and argue that at this point, Washington has been driven out of New York, Washington has been driven out of New Jersey, Congress had a run from Philadelphia, they were meeting in New York. In 1777, Washington did nothing but lose. He lost at the Battle of Brandywine, he lost at the Battle of Germantown. Gates appears to be a winner. He won the Battle of Saratoga, if you ignore Benedict Arnold's. So there were a variety of people that were obviously looking to elevate themselves, but there was some legitimate concern here. Okay? Obviously, the benefit of George Washington was keeping the revolution alive, dealing with all of these personalities, people who were in Congress. The people who were in Congress in 1777 are not the people who signed the Declaration in 1776. They were more venal. They were more selfish, yet Washington is able to deal with these people to get the army alive, to keep the army alive, to keep the revolution alive. So Wilkinson duels Gates, he misses. He also marries Anne Nancy Biddle of the Philadelphia Biddles, a very wealthy Quaker family that was making lots of money selling goods to the Continental Army. And also important for us here today, they invested much of the money they were making in land holdings out in Kentucky. Okay, so the Biddle family owns lots of lands out in Kentucky, and and as time then goes by, Wilkinson is forced to resign his general officer commission because most of the other officers in the Continental Army were absolutely appalled that this guy who has never commanded troops in combat, who was tied in with his cabal, is being promoted to general officer, yet others here who have fought long and hard with Washington, they're in Valley Forge right now, we're not getting anything. We're not being recognized. And so as a result of this, Wilkinson decides, I have to resign my commission. So he was a general officer for about 6 months. And the only thing he did during that period of time was work with Gates and dealing with this particular conspiracy. So that was his general officer background, and he decides, I'm going to go look at the Biddle investments in Kentucky. And so he sells the estate that he owned outside of Philadelphia, or leaves his wife and children behind to sell that particular estate, and move to Kentucky. And this happens in 1783. Now, I don't need to tell this audience what Kentucky was like in 1783. Okay, it was a growing area of western Virginia. The two primary ways to get into Kentucky were down the Ohio River, and then you would go down the Kentucky River or the Cumberland River, one of the other rivers that go to the interior from the Ohio River, or come up from the south of the Wilderness Road. For people living in Kentucky at this time, what was absolutely critical was if we are growing tobacco, if we are manufacturing whiskey and we want to sell this to have some form of commerce, that commerce has to go down the Ohio and go down the Mississippi and go out then to the world through New Orleans. But in 1783, the Spanish, who are sort of kind of like our allies in the Revolution, decide we're not going to allow the Americans to have access to the Mississippi River. You're not going to be allowed to travel through New Orleans, which basically is a stranglehold for the people of Kentucky. Secondly, there are great concerns here by the people in Kentucky that neither the Commonwealth of Virginia nor the Congress in New York at the time give a darn about the people of Kentucky, give a darn about the people out in the West. And so indeed, at the time, John Jay, who is the Secretary of State, is directed by the Convention Congress to negotiate a treaty with the Spanish that would basically say this: we don't care about the Mississippi. Go ahead and block it. Give us advanced trading rights on the East Coast. Allow ports like New York and Philadelphia and Boston to have expanded trade with Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, with Spain in Europe, and we'll give up the West. Unfortunately, this particular treaty was never ratified by Congress, but it showed the citizens of Kentucky, you're pretty much on your own here. You're going to be strangled by the Spanish, and people in Richmond and people in New York really don't care anything about you. So Wilkinson properly thinks the way to deal with this is, let's find some way to open up New Orleans. And we'll also talk about here, the last point here is that, and obviously there's large problems dealing with relationships between the white citizens in Kentucky and the Native American tribes that are here, who are very upset about white settlements in the upper Northwest and here in Kentucky, infringing on their traditional native lands. So those are two of the major concerns for the people of Kentucky at the time that Wilkinson arrives. So he arrives in Lexington in 1783 and decides to engage in a series of commercial activities. Number one, he's going to involve in land acquisition. He's following the Biddles. He's going to buy up lots of property. And obviously, that's one of the places he bought up was here in Frankfort. But he bought up in lots of other places. He would engage in trading. The trouble is, the Spanish are clogging the Mississippi River. He can't get Kentucky goods out through New Orleans. And he's trying to help his wife, Anne, deal with living on the frontier. Now, one of the things that I mention in my book is Wilkinson, in many regards, betrayed just about everybody he worked for, with, or near. The one thing he did not betray was his wife, and he and his wife had a loving and loyal marriage, and she followed him to frontier posts throughout the West. She went to Cuba with him. She endangered her health as a result of it, and as a result of that, he decides where we live in Kentucky, and that was in Lexington, that was in Louisville, and that was here in Frankfort. We're going to build a nice mansion so that we can try to replicate as best we can here on the frontier the kind of life you're used to in Philadelphia. She wasn't a big fan of Frankfort. So in February of 1788, when Wilkinson is gone dealing with the Spanish, she writes a letter to her father and talking about how unhappy she is here in Frankfort. And one of the things she says here is that it is impossible for me to describe the torture my mind endures, not been blessed with the sight of a relation in 10 months and surrounded by people that has been brought up so differently from myself that when sick and low spirited there, the company only disgusts me. So, Wilkinson decides, I have to break the stranglehold that the Spanish have on Kentucky. And so in 1787, he gets together with some other merchants throughout Kentucky and decides, I'm going to take a bunch of goods that Kentucky is capable of producing, and that would be corn, that would be tobacco, and that would be slaves, and go down to the Spanish officials in New Orleans and see if I can negotiate a way that they will open up the Mississippi River to a trading monopoly that Wilkinson is supposed to control. So in 1787, he travels down the Mississippi to New Orleans. So why Spain? Why was Spain so important at the time? Well, at the time here, you can see the United States is here east of the Mississippi. And many of the states that later exist, such as Tennessee and Kentucky, are part of eastern states. You've got territories loosely down here, that part of Georgia, what is ultimately going to become Mississippi and Alabama. But the Spanish control the entire Gulf Coast down here. So if you're living in Alabama, or if you're living in Mississippi, and you'd like to trade through Mobile, you'd like to trade through Pensacola, if you're over here in Georgia, you'd like to trade through St. Augustine, those ports are all closed to you. And the port of New Orleans is closed to you as well. But Spain owns everything west of the Mississippi, and so obviously having a relationship with Spain is important both to the United States, but it's important to the trading monopoly that Wilkinson wanted to create. So in 1787, he writes his first memorial to the Spanish government. And that memorial is basically this. Number one, I will renounce my U.S. citizenship and swear allegiance to the King of Spain. Okay, so here we have an American general officer saying, I don't want to be an American any longer, I want to be a Spaniard. Obviously, this is hidden. This isn't published to anybody other than the Spanish. And indeed, this document remains hidden until the early part of the 20th century. Nobody knew that Wilkinson had done this, but the Spanish kept excellent records that only became available to American scholars in the beginning of the 20th century. So we don't know Wilkinson said, I'm going to switch my allegiance, and in return for this, I'm going to give you recommendations that as a businessman here in Kentucky, if I were you Spanish, I would do this. Number one, I would continue to deny Americans access to the port of New Orleans. Wilkinson, should be the only person who has a monopoly to trade through New Orleans. Secondly, you should erect forts on the Mississippi River. Those sneaky Americans are going to try to come down the river. You need to build forts that will stop those sneaky Americans from getting down. Third, when I go back to Kentucky, that is still fighting to determine what they're going to be, and we'll get to that in a moment, I will work with a variety of other residents of Kentucky, senior business officials here, to say we need to break away from the United States and form a relationship with Spain. If we do this, we get the Mississippi, we get New Orleans. And last but not least, I will warn you about something called filibusters. During the late 1700s and early 1800s, there were a variety of private expeditions that were being raised in the United States to have private individuals raise a private army and go down and seize Spanish Mexico, seize Florida. I will warn you about these filibusters that take place. And one of them he warned about was being run by George Rogers Clark, another famous Western person who was in league with the French to lead a filibustering expedition down to seize Spanish Mexico. So I'm going to tip you off to all this stuff. In return, you're going to give me a monopoly. This is the beginning of what is known as the Spanish conspiracy. It was an attempt by the Spanish government using Wilkinson to corrupt a variety of Western political officials that as they decide what's going to happen with what eventually becomes Kentucky, what's going to happen with Tennessee. And so basically at this time, the people of Kentucky are debating, number one, should we remain part of Virginia? Number two, should we become our own Commonwealth? Number three, should we break off and become our own independent country aligned with Spain? Or four, let's just join the Spanish Empire. And so the Spanish conspiracy was the Spanish working through Wilkinson to identify politicians here in Kentucky that would be willing to deal with the Spanish to remove Kentucky from the United States and form some sort of alliance with Spain. At this time, Wilkinson gets the spy name of Agent 13. Wilkinson and the Spanish practiced excellent tradecraft when it comes to espionage at the time. They used ciphers, they used cutouts, they used cover stories, they used cover companies to hide the fact that they were dealing with each other here. And the fact that the information that Wilkinson provided wasn't particularly helpful is beside the point. The point is these people were actively trying to break up the United States and lure these portions of the country into some form of relationship with Spain. That was the essence of the Spanish conspiracy. So whom did Wilkinson claim he dealt with? A number of very important people who were part of the founding of, ultimately, the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Harry Ennis, the first, was Wilkinson's private attorney. He was the first federal judge appointed here. Supposedly, according to Wilkinson, he recommended that the Spanish bribe Ennis. Now, they've never been able to prove that, but obviously he was a name that Wilkinson threw out. And one of the problems that historians to this day have in trying to figure out who was part of the Spanish conspiracy was, Wilkinson lied repeatedly regarding his influence. And so he named names, but that didn't necessarily mean he was able to successfully bring these people on board. One of the persons he did bring on board was Benjamin Sebastian, one of the first judges of the Kentucky Supreme Court. And so eventually the Kentucky House of Representatives was able to prove that Sebastian had accepted money from the Spanish. And when they looked at it, it was for the mostly they put Sebastian on the payroll to keep an eye on Wilkinson. The Spanish didn't trust Wilkinson. The Spanish were more skeptical of Wilkinson than the United States government was. They recognized, hey, the only reason why this guy is working for us is not that he loves Spain, it's basically ego and money, okay? And as long as those two were fed, he'll work for you, but, so Sebastian was tied in here. George Mutter was another one that were never able to prove, first Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals here. John Brown. Okay, when we toured around today, we saw a lot about John Brown. There's been a lot of historical study to determine what was Brown's involvement. And the historians have concluded that, yes, indeed, Brown was in communication with Spanish officials about the possibility of joining Spain, but never fully entered into the conspiracy and never accepted any money. But his name was also dragged into this. And there were 20 different officials that Wilkinson said, you should bribe these people, and how many were actually bribed isn't at all clear. The problem is Wilkinson's trading monopoly didn't work, okay? He wants to sell agricultural products, he wants to sell livestock, he wants to sell enslaved persons. And so he gets a great deal of money as a result of his first trip. He returns here to Frankfort in a coach where he's got liveried slaves as outriders driving the coach to show, hey, I'm a really wealthy guy and we can make this thing work. Trouble is it didn't work for a variety of reasons. Number one, the Spanish double-crossed him. Wilkinson thought he was going to be getting a monopoly. They entered into a similar relationship with a broad variety of other business people here in Kentucky. So Wilkinson did not get the monopoly he had hoped. Secondly, Wilkinson was an incredibly bad businessman. Okay, his companies bled money. His partner committed suicide because of the economic distress that the company had. At one point, their entire cargo was sold down in down in New Orleans. He decides, hey, let's make this a two-way trading relationship. Let's sail back up the Mississippi with a bunch of stuff we'll buy here with our profits down here in New Orleans. Boats never made it up the Mississippi. They all sunk, because he hired an inexperienced crew. So by 1791, okay, Wilkinson is selling all the land that he owns here in Kentucky because he can't make his business work. He is still assisting the Spanish. So the United States Army, under a guy by the name of Colonel Dougherty, was told to survey a road that would go from Nashville to Natchez, and that ultimately becomes the Natchez Trace, one of the more important north-south roadways in the United States. Wilkinson tells the Spanish, hey, this guy is out surveying. I don't want this road built because this will impact on my monopoly. You and Indians who are allied with you need to go out and kill this expedition. And they do. So we have him directly involved in harming a U.S. exploration expedition at this particular period of time. Finally, by 1789, Wilkinson says, look, this isn't working economically. I want to be put on the Spanish payroll directly. Okay? I want to become a paid officer of the Spanish government, and I want to proudly proclaim I'm a Spanish citizen and I'm a paid Spanish official. And the Spanish say, no, don't roll back your cover. You're worth more to us as an undercover agent, but we will put you on the payroll. And so starting in 1789, Wilkinson is a paid employee of the Spanish government. And that continues until 1798. So he gets a good chunk of money. He gets $2,000 a year. Later on, that's raised to $4,000 a year. That's in 1789 money. He still can't make a go of it. At the same time, the citizens of Kentucky are being impacted by what is known as the Northwest Indian War. A variety of tribes, Shawnees, Miamis, Kickapoos, are all up in arms over white encroachments into the Northwest. And that also then bleeds over into Kentucky. And so the thought is by Washington now, who is president in 1789, the Constitution is passed, Washington is president, Henry Knox is the Secretary of War. The thought was, let's put down these Indians by sending the army out to do that. The trouble was, by 1789, there's nothing left of the army. Okay, the entire Continental Army was thought to be too expensive to maintain. So there's only one regiment of U.S. soldiers that exist right now, and they're scattered all over forts in the West. So the thought was in 1790, let's expand the army, let's bring a whole new bunch of people on board, and we'll put General Joseph Haymore in charge of this particular army, and we will send them off to fight the Indians. And the concern here is that it wasn't just the Indians. The British, under the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, were supposed to give up a variety of northern forts, like Detroit, like Niagara, like Fort Michilimackinac. The British refused to evacuate these posts and use them to sell weapons to the Indians and then to encourage the Indians to go raid the American settlements on the western frontier. So with the British encouragement, the Indians are up in rebellion. And so the thought would be is, let's raise the army, let's raise new troops, and send them out to fight the Indians. The trouble is, Harmer followed Washington and Knox's direction that they needed to get right away before the troops were adequately supplied and trained. Also, Harmer has a reputation of being an alcoholic. And so this untrained, unsupplied army, led by an alcoholic, goes out into the backwoods of Ohio and is defeated by the Indian Confederacy, and they all come back to Cincinnati. Well, a few of them that are left all come back to Cincinnati. Washington and Knox decide, we need to do this again. Let's do it the next year, 1791. We'll raise even more people, and we'll put Arthur St. Clair in charge of the army. At the time, St. Clair was the governor of the territory of Ohio. The trouble was the army wasn't properly supplied, the army wasn't properly trained, and St. Clair at this time is suffering from gout. He can't ride a horse. So how he's expected to command this army when he can't even ride a horse, it's not clear. But in November 1791, he goes out and fights a battle that is known by one of two names. Either A, the battle that has no name, or B, St. Clair's defeat. And this is the single largest defeat by an American army in the entire Indian Wars. 900 soldiers are wiped out in this particular battle. If you compare and contrast, everybody knows about Custer and the Little Bighorn. There were 225 troopers with Custer, 900 people with St. Clair. Okay, the army is wiped out. Where's Wilkinson in all of this? Well, Wilkinson now has joined the Kentucky militia, which is commanded by General Charles Scott. Scott doesn't like St. Clair. And so he decides, we're not going with you. And so therefore, the Kentucky militia avoided being slaughtered with the rest of St. Clair's people because Scott did not trust St. Clair, and his judgment on this obviously was absolutely correct. So what happens now? We're going to expand the army again, and Wilkinson decides that for the purposes of bread and fame, I'm going to give up all of my commercial enterprises and rejoin the military. And so Washington looks at who should command the brand new regiment of infantry that is being created and decides to make James Wilkinson the commander of this second regiment. And the primary reason he did that is Washington knew Wilkinson had no combat record at all from the Revolution. His time as a general officer was 6 months. He was never in combat, but he was from Kentucky. And a future invasion of the Indians was going to rely very heavily on Kentucky militia, Kentucky people joining the American army. And Wilkinson was thought as, because of your relationship with Kentucky, you should be the commanding officer of this new regiment. So Wilkinson is appointed the lieutenant colonel and commanding of the regiment. And now that St. Clair has been destroyed, we need to find a new commanding general. And they look at a variety of people who were general officers during the Revolution, and they pick Anthony Wayne as the major general commanding the Legion of the United States, and they promote Wilkinson now to brigadier general. Wayne is not going to follow the mistakes that Harmer and St. Clair did. I'm going to take my time before I go out and fight the Indians. We're going to get them properly trained. We're going to get them properly supplied. So it's going to take me 2 or 3 years to get out there. Wilkinson is apoplectic that Wayne has been picked. He thought he should be the commanding general of the army, even though Wayne had a far superior combat record during the Revolution. So during the 4 years it takes Wayne to get ready, Wilkinson is hoping he fails so that Washington will appoint Wilkinson as the commanding general. So he divides the officer corps. He tells other officers, hey, Wayne is a drunk. Wayne is stealing your payroll. He accepts bribes from contractors to slow down the delivery of goods that are being delivered to Wayne so he can go out and fight this. And then behind Wayne's back, Wilkinson starts sending letters to Washington and Knox saying, you need to fire Wayne and replace him with me. And Wayne is completely unaware of all of this. And Washington and Knox don't tell him. So finally, in 1794, Wayne leads the army into a successful victory over the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers outside of Toledo. And now they've put down the Indian rebellion that exists here. The trouble is, shortly thereafter, he finds out about what Wilkinson has been saying and decides, I'm going to start investigating Wilkinson's relationship with the Spanish. Okay? I think he's a Spanish spy. And so the only investigation at this time of was Wilkinson a Spanish spy was being done by Anthony Wayne. Unfortunately, in December of 1796, he dies. And now Wilkinson is the last man standing as an appointed the commanding general of the U.S. Army. And the investigations of his ties with the Spanish stop. Also affecting Kentucky and everybody else in the West are 3 treaties which were negotiated in 1795. First is the Treaty of Greenville, where the Indians in Ohio basically give up the Ohio Territory and agree to move to Indiana and Illinois. And so that allows white settlement to take place in Ohio and allows ultimately Ohio to become a state in the United States. Secondly, you have the Treaty of Jay's Treaty. The British finally agree to move out of all of these forts, Detroit, Michilimackinac, Niagara, and there's another one in Vermont. We're going to finally give up what we agreed in 1783 to give up. We're finally getting around 12 years later to do it. And then equally important is a treaty with the Spanish, the Treaty of San Lorenzo. We will open up by treaty the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans to Western states. And so you will have free access. There's no longer a need for a Wilkinson monopoly. The Spanish by treaty now have agreed to allow Kentucky goods to be freely sold in New Orleans. Wilkinson, as a result of this, in 1798 tells the Spanish, you know, duty and honor require me to end my relationship with you. But before I do that, you need to pay me all the back pay you owe me. So they eventually pay up, and he stopped now, in 1798 at least, accepting money from the Spanish. And in 1801, Thomas Jefferson becomes the President of the United States. And so Jefferson doesn't like the Army. He thinks that Washington and Adams has filled the Army up with a bunch of incompetent Federalists. And he wants these incompetent Federalists to be removed and to be replaced by incompetent people who are Democratic Republicans. And so Jefferson brings in Meriwether Lewis, okay, who was a neighbor of his down in Charlottesville, to identify who are all the officers that need to be removed because they were known Federalists. Well, who's the biggest Federalist out there? It's Wilkinson. Okay, he's been the commanding general under Washington. He's been the commanding general under Adams. But Wilkinson was an excellent chameleon. And he's able to convince Jefferson, hey, I'm a good Democratic Republican. I've been a closet Democratic Republican all this time. And so he's allowed to remain as the commanding general of the U.S. Army under Jefferson. But Jefferson doesn't like the Army and basically tells Wilkinson, I really don't need an army. You need to spend your time negotiating treaties with the Indians and mapping out the Natchez Trace. So the better part of 3 years, Wilkinson isn't even in Washington to command the Army. He's out here in the West dealing with Indian tribes and dealing with the Natchez Trace. Wilkinson's only connection to the Jefferson administration is through Vice President Aaron Burr. Wilkinson had met Burr in Canada when they both fought under Benedict Arnold. Burr helped one of Wilkinson's children get into Princeton University. And so the two of them had a pretty good working relationship. But by this time, 1801, Jefferson hates Burr. He thinks that Burr tried to steal the presidency from him in the election of 1800 and basically has put Burr aside. So Burr is sitting out on the side as the vice president. He's told, you're not going to be around for a second Jefferson administration. Wilkinson has been thrown out into the wilderness. The both of them are sort of at the bottom of their career. And so what changes on that is the Louisiana Purchase. By 1802, the United States is worried that France, who is now, Napoleon has conquered Spain, that Napoleon is going to try to recreate a French empire here in the United States. And so Jefferson sends a delegation to Paris to buy the city of New Orleans. Napoleon has changed his mind about a U.S. empire and tells them, hey, I won't just sell you New Orleans, I'll sell you the entire Louisiana territory. And so that is agreed to in December of 1803 in New Orleans. Spain turns over the Louisiana territory to France, and France will turn it over to the United States. Jefferson needs a senior official to represent the United States at the turnover, who happens to be in the neighborhood, James Wilkinson. And so Wilkinson represents the United States at this turnover operation that takes place in December. The Spanish are going to be there. Wilkinson sees an opportunity to shake the Spanish down once again. So he solicits them to give him a $20,000 bribe, which in today's money is $500,000. And he says, look, if you put me back on the payroll, I, as the commanding general of the U.S. Army, will give you information about U.S. Army troop movements and dispositions. I will compromise all of Jefferson's explorations of the Louisiana Purchase. I'll go into that in just a moment. And, okay, I will use my position, because I meet with the president of the cabinet regularly, you give me your intelligence requirements, and I'll go ask them questions on your behalf. Picture someone like the former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, Mark Milley, being on the Chinese payroll and offering to provide this kind of information to the Chinese. That's how bad the espionage that Wilkinson is thinking about committing was taking place at this time. He also knows that Daniel Boone has now moved from Kentucky and has founded a settlement on the Missouri River. He tells the Spanish, you need to go wipe that out. Okay, that's not going to be good for you. You need to go wipe out Boone's settlement on the Missouri River. The Spanish say, look, we'll be glad to put you back on the payroll. We only have $12,000 on hand. We don't have the $20,000. Is $12,000 good enough? And Wilkinson says yes. And so this brings the total amount of money that Wilkinson has received from the Spanish over the years to over $1 million in our valuation. The concern is, was this treason? And the answer is probably not. And I'll show you that when we talk in a moment here about the Aaron Burr treason trials. So Wilkinson is now back on the Spanish payroll. He's back in Jefferson's good graces. And this is what the United States looks like after the Louisiana Purchase. All of this is now the United States, but you can still see our major partner here, or border sharer here, is still Spain. And so that's why Wilkinson's relationship with the Spanish remains to be important to Spain, because they're concerned about United States incursions on Spanish territory. Jefferson wanted the Louisiana Purchase to be explored. So he commissions 3 separate exploration parties to go explore the new Louisiana territory. So up north here, up the Missouri River, all the way out here to Oregon, is the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. Wilkinson tells the Spanish, you need to send Spanish cavalry out to find the Lewis and Clark expedition and capture or kill them. And the Spanish try it, but they never find Lewis and Clark, and they successfully complete their exploration. There's a second exploration of the central area here going out to Colorado and New Mexico, done by Zebulon Pike. Spanish capture Pike because they've been tipped off by Wilkinson. They don't kill him, but that expedition for the most part fails because Pike has been captured. There was a third expedition to explore here along the southern border, along the Red River. Wilkinson alerts the Spanish. The Americans see the Spanish when they get a quarter of the way up the river and decide, we're better off going home. So Wilkinson has attempted to compromise all 3 of these expeditions by his mentor now, Thomas Jefferson, because he wants to earn his Spanish payroll. He now also wants to become, because he's in good graces now with Jefferson, he wants to be double dip and be named the governor of the new Louisiana territory. So when this territory is created, Congress decides we're going to create 2 territories here. One is going to be the Orleans Territory, which eventually becomes the state of Louisiana. The rest of it is the Louisiana Territory, and Wilkinson wants to become governor. He wants to remain the commanding general. He wants to be the governor of the Louisiana Territory. And so in order to get this, he starts working with Aaron Burr. Now, Burr, by this time, has killed Alexander Hamilton. He did not run for re-election, but Jefferson needs Burr as the vice president of the Senate to do something for him during the last 60 days of the Congress where Burr is president of the Senate. So Burr and Jefferson reach a deal. I'll do what you want as president of the Senate. You make Wilkinson the governor of the Louisiana Territory. So in April 1805, after a series of meetings with Burr, Wilkinson is named by Jefferson to be the governor of the Louisiana Territory, and now we start Wilkinson working on the Burr conspiracy. What was the Burr conspiracy? Historians to this day don't know exactly what it was. because Burr told different people different things in order to get their support, but many of the things he told these different organizations were inherently conflicting. So for a variety of people, he would tell, to include people like Andrew Jackson, I'm going to raise a filibuster to seize Spanish Mexico. I'm not going to do anything to harm the United States. I want to seize Spanish Mexico. Jackson, will you support it? He does. And so Wilkinson arranges a variety of meetings with Burr, with a variety of Western officials that are out here, to get them on board with this filibustering expedition. To other people, Burr represents, hey, in addition to attacking Spanish territory, I want to break off the Western states. This is the Spanish conspiracy all over again, but instead of going with Spain, let's go to a new country where Aaron Burr will be the president of this new country. To still others, specifically the Spanish, he says, I'm going to lead a coup d'etat against Thomas Jefferson. And he's able to get money from the Spanish to overthrow Thomas Jefferson. So these three different stories are told to three different groups of people, and he hopes that none of these people will talk back and forth. And on point number one, Wilkinson is going to be his number two person. Wilkinson is going to be his second in command. And so the two of them negotiate the fact that Wilkinson is going to be his second in command. And the thought would be is Wilkinson will take the American army down to the border with Spain and create a diplomatic incident that will be the signal for the United States and Spain to go to war, and for Aaron Burr to raise troops and go and help seize Spanish Mexico. A famous Kentucky official, Joseph Hamilton Davies, who was the Federalist U.S. Attorney here in Kentucky, hears about this. Hears about Wilkinson's relationship with Burr, hears about Wilkinson's relationship with the Spanish, and he starts sending a series of letters to Thomas Jefferson. You need to do something about this. Your commanding general here is entering into an improper relationship with Spain as well as with Aaron Burr. Jefferson ignores them. And so as we get close to the point where Wilkinson is supposed to take the army down and cause a problem, okay, Wilkinson chokes. And he turns in Burr to Jefferson. And he sends correspondence, and he erases his name from all the correspondence, so it appears that he's never been in cahoots with Aaron Burr. And so this begins what I call an unholy alliance between Jefferson and Wilkinson, that Wilkinson will provide whatever evidence Jefferson needs to convict Burr of treason, and Jefferson will do whatever he needs to do to protect Wilkinson from people who are going to come after him. So in the summer of 1807, Aaron Burr goes on trial in Richmond for treason. Wilkinson is supposed to be the primary witness against him. He's a terrible witness. Okay, and as a result, the U.S. Attorney doesn't want to put Wilkinson on the stand. John Marshall, who is the Chief Justice of the United States, is the trial judge, and he rules that treason, as defined by the Constitution, is one of two things. Number one, you're making war against the United States, or two, you're providing aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States. And Burr is acquitted because the government can't prove that he did either. So going back with Wilkinson, even though he's accepting all this money from Spain, Spain isn't an enemy of the United States. We're not at war with Spain. So what Wilkinson did wasn't technically treason, it was espionage. Okay? And that wasn't a crime until the 20th century. So there are a variety of military officials that Wilkinson could have been involved with. So let me bring this to a conclusion. So Wilkinson is now commanding general of the army again, and he's told, take the army down to New Orleans because we suspect the British are going to invade New Orleans. And so he brings a newly expanded army down to New Orleans, and here's New Orleans, and here's the Mississippi River. And so the thought would be is the British are going to come up the Mississippi, so I need to figure out a place to put them. Wilkinson is upset about all the troops that are here in New Orleans because it's a flesh pot. And so all of these soldiers are being wined and dined, and we need to get them out of New Orleans. So he picks a spot here in the swamp. They're given bad food. Why? Wilkinson accepted bribes from the food contractor to ignore the fact that they were giving bad food. There's insufficient medicine, there's insufficient clothing. And why this particular swamp here? Well, Wilkinson's first wife, Anne, died a couple of years earlier of tuberculosis. And Wilkinson now is courting the daughter of the guy who owns the swamp. So, newly elected President Madison is ordering Wilkinson, get the troops out of there. He doesn't want to do it. He finally is given a direct order to do it. But 1/4 of the United States Army dies in this swamp under Wilkinson's command. They die or desert. It's the single largest casualty event ever to take place regarding the United States Army. Now, something's got to be done. Congress is after him, and so the decision is, let's court-martial him. And so he's going to be court-martialed in Frederick. And so when I looked at the court-martial here, I approached it as a trial attorney. Given the evidence, how would I have tried this case? And I look at how the case was tried, and there's something really, really wrong here with how this court-martial was done. First, Wilkinson is charged with an improper relationship with Spain that goes back to 1787. He wasn't even in the Army until 1791. You can't be charged under the Articles of War for crimes when you're not a soldier. Yet that's how these charges read. And it turns out Wilkinson wanted to be charged for this misconduct because he knew he was going to get acquitted. And he wanted 20 years of misconduct to be washed away by a not guilty verdict. Secondly, the military at the time had a 2-year statute of limitations. It's 1811. How can you charge someone for a crime they committed in 1787 when there's a 2-year statute of limitations? Wilkinson waived any objections to the statute of limitations. He wanted the trial to take place. He also helped pick the jury. How you can expect these people to do a conviction when Wilkinson writes the charges and Wilkinson helps pick the jury? So needless to say, his defense was the government witnesses are all liars. I have this cover story to cover how I got all this money from Spain. It's all a late payment from when I was in commerce here in Kentucky. They just paid me 20 years late. Burr, I turned in Burr. Okay? And so the charge there was that you were conspiring with known traitors. Burr and his conspirators have all been acquitted. So how you can claim that Wilkinson was conspiring with known traitors when all these people have already been acquitted? That charge was obviously going to be dismissed. And he says, down in New Orleans, I did the best I could. And there probably was not a single military officer there on that jury who thinks, there but for the grace of God go I. And they found Wilkinson not guilty of all the charges that were there. So, in February of 1812, the president approves the charges, and Wilkinson now is sent back to New Orleans because now we're at war with the British. The War of 1812 has started. And so the only successful campaign in Wilkinson's 40-year career was he goes down to New Orleans and is given orders, seize Mobile, Alabama. And he does without firing a shot. In an excellently conducted campaign, he seizes Mobile, Alabama, which is the only successful land grab that we got as a result of the War of 1812. But the people in New Orleans can't stand him, and so he's transferred to the Northern Army. And so in 1813, he's put in charge of an invasion of Canada. There's two things I've learned dealing with military history. Okay, there's two primary maxims. Number one, don't get involved in a land war in Asia. And number two, don't invade Canada in the fall. So in November of 1813, a two-pronged army under Wilkinson's command invades Canada. One comes from Plattsburgh up here, the traditional route to Montreal. They just get over the border, and they're defeated by a Canadian force that was like a quarter of the size of the United States Army. And so they retreat back here and give up. Wilkinson is in command of another group that's going to go down the St. Lawrence River. They only enter the St. Lawrence River on like the 7th of November. They've already hit blizzards and hurricanes. The boats have all been, many of the boats have been sunk. The supplies are lost. Wilkinson, by this time, is drunk and on laudanum. And so when the British finally catch up with Wilkinson at a battle called Chrysler's Farm, Wilkinson is too sick even to leave his boat to command the army. And so once again, an army 1/4 of the size of the U.S. Army defeats the U.S. Army, and Wilkinson is forced now to retreat back to the United States, ending the invasion of Canada. The decision is made then, somebody has to be held responsible. And so Wilkinson is court-martialed again in 1815 and acquitted again. Okay, most of the government witnesses don't even bother to show up for trial. Okay, because they all recognize the war is over and Wilkinson is going to get kicked out of the army because there's a whole new group of competent generals who can't stand him. We don't want to be involved in a court-martial. And so, number one, most of the government witnesses don't show up. Two, the witnesses that do show up are the jury who all testify on Wilkinson's behalf. So needless to say, he's found not guilty the second time, but a few months later, he's finally forcibly retired. So how do you make money then when you've been thrown out like this? You write your memoirs. So and for two reasons. Number one, to settle scores. I got a whole bunch of people I hate, that now's my chance to go after them. And two, to try to make money. I had to wade through these 3 volumes, and you can see two historians. One here says, 3 ponderous volumes of memoirs as false as any yet written by man. Or doubtless the most mendacious book ever published in America. Needless to say, he does not make his fortune on that. He goes with his new wife back down to New Orleans to open up a sugar plantation. That's business. He can't do business. And so he decides, hey, the Mexican Revolution has just taken place, okay? What do I know better than anything else? International intrigue. Let me go down to Mexico City, and maybe the United States will name me the first minister to Mexico. The trouble is, by this point, James Monroe is president of the United States. And earlier, when he was offered a job at an earlier administration where he'd have to work for Wilkinson, Monroe said, I would sooner be shot than take a job when I would report to James Wilkinson. So there's no way President Monroe was going to name him our first ambassador to Mexico. He named someone by the name of Joel Poinsett, who was our first ambassador to Mexico. Poinsett was an amateur horticulturist. And you probably can see out here, he, quote, discovered the Christmas flower, which he named after himself, the poinsettia. And so in 1825, Wilkinson dies alone and is buried in an unmarked grave in Mexico City.
A happy ending.
So just a final slide. There are some still ongoing mysteries dealing with Wilkinson. One is, did he murder Meriwether Lewis? In the 80s, a number of historians came up with the fact that he murdered Meriwether Lewis. And that's a story for another day. I don't think it happened, but it was clearly something that was looked at. Now, another one was, did he murder Anthony Wayne? Wayne thought he attempted to murder him by chopping down a tree that landed on Wayne's tent. But he was never able to prove it, and he died before anybody was able to investigate it. Another mystery is, why did 4 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, rely on someone with Wilkinson's record to be the commanding general? And for the most part, it was because they didn't care that much about the military, and it was too much political trouble to deal with them until they finally got around to court-martialing him. But those court-martials were never meant to hold him accountable. They were meant to create a whitewash to make it all go away. And then last but not least, which I think is relevant today, is why did all these oversight mechanisms, presidential oversight, congressional oversight, military justice, why did none of these work? And do they work today? Okay. That's my point. I thank you very much for your attention. I'd be glad to address any questions you might have. Sir. I was kind of hoping to go into this with the thought that everybody who has written a biography about him in the past have said nothing but bad things about him. I was kind of hoping maybe I can bring a fresh perspective in and say that maybe he was, a double agent or something like that. Maybe what he was doing was being sanctioned. Never found anything of it. He was as bad as the previous biographers has contended, perhaps even worse. Sir.
I finished your book last night, and I really congratulate you.
Thank you.
You've made your case. And I think something that in recent American history, in my old age, I've unfortunately become very cynical. And your book reveals that the cynicism displayed by some of our founding fathers has always been there.
It's nothing new.
So nothing's
Yeah, I,
new and very, very sad.
I couldn't agree with you more. And part of the goal here was to show that, look, all the bad things we talk about going on today, founding fathers had feet of clay. Many of them did. And so we should revere them for the incredible thing that they did, but they weren't all saints, and they made mistakes, and we need to understand those mistakes to put what's going on today in context.
One thing I really learned from your book, I'm from Lexington, and James Morrison, who is considered probably the greatest philanthropist in Lexington history, the building named for him is on the seal of the city, was, according to you, the person who sold the bad food.
Yes.
And I'm wondering about, I'm normally against cancel culture, but do we want to keep naming things after people like
Who did that? You raise an excellent point. And on Morrison, I found in the archives of Wilkinson's papers, and I quote them, you can clearly see, hey, look, I will give you $12,000 worth of horses. You look the other way while I give you bad food. Just damning. Okay, and that was never.
his name is on a tablet in the back of my church.
And unfortunately, that letter was never introduced into evidence at Wilkinson's trial. Okay, so he was never tried for accepting bribes. They overlooked that evidence, and so I don't know exactly when it was found, but to me, it clearly established.
Nice thing about Kentucky horses.
Yes. Any other questions? Sir?
I realize they were at different time frames a little bit, but did Wilkinson ever cross paths with Henry Clay? And if he saw, what was the context of that?
So the only direct relationship I'm aware of where Wilkinson came close to dealing with Clay was when Burr was heading here through Kentucky, supposedly to invade New Orleans, and Wilkinson was defending New Orleans. Clay represented him when he was arrested here and got him off. Okay, so it wasn't until later on. So I have not found any direct relationship between Henry Clay, who was a young congressman at the time, who was Speaker of the House and the War Hawk. I never found anything from Wilkinson indicating a relationship.
Clay said that he always regretted acquitting him acquitted.
I'll bet he did.
That was one of his low points of his career.
Yes. Sir?
What do you think of his personality? To have conned so many people, he must have had a charisma or something about him.
He was obsequious, which went over big with a lot of different people. But he was incredibly loyal to his wife and family. Just incredible. There was never a hint that he cheated on his wife or did anything. But beyond that, it was just like if he had the opportunity to cheat, he'd take it, whether that was a friend or an enemy or a potential friend or a potential enemy. His default would be, let me see if I can lie. It's just unfortunate. Yes, ma'am.
Conflict partly because you know anything about his personality, his persuasiveness, his eloquence.
He was well-spoken, and again, part of it being obsequious then to his superiors, he was able to pull the wool over many of their eyes. But part of it was when, one of the things that they taught me in spy school was that why do people become spies? Okay, and it's something called MICE. M, money, I, Jesus Christ. C is coercion, E is ego, and I is ideology. So it's money, ideology, coercion, ego are the 4 reasons. Wilkinson became a spy. Ego, okay, he thought that he would deserve better than what the U.S. government was giving him, and he was greedy. He wanted money. So those were the 2 primary drivers, at least regarding his espionage.
One thing, you don't go into the, I'm very interested in the Biddle family in Philadelphia. Were they implicated in any bad things that he did?
I never saw any of it, although obviously he got a lot of money from the Biddle family. I didn't go and mention here was after he resigned from the Continental Army, the Biddle family encouraged him to take the civilian position of being the clothier general of the army. Okay, because they were making money on selling clothes. If their son-in-law was a clothier general, that would be a good business opportunity. But I'm not aware of any frauds that the Biddles engaged in. And Wilkinson got fired after a year of being a clothier general because he just had no head for business. Right, exactly. But it paid his salary, and that's what he was looking for. Yes, ma'am.
How long had he lived in Mexico before he died?
So he went down in 1782 and died in 1722 to 1725, so 3 years. And I don't think he saw his family the entire time he was down there. So he left his wife, and by that time he had young children with his second wife. He never saw them again. Sir?
He was involved in 2 duels. Was he ever shot at?
Okay, so Gates shot at him and missed as well. Okay, they engaged in 2 duels. They never fired in the first one. They both fired the second one. They both missed. So he was challenged to a duel many times later on. Okay, and he challenged a variety of people to duels, but I think the 2 with Gates are the only 2 that he actually ever engaged in.
Was dueling legal back then?
No. Okay, clearly it was in violation of the Articles of War. So as military officers, these people are not allowed to do it. It was never enforced.
Well, why was Aaron Burr never prosecuted for the duel when he killed Alexander Hamilton?
He was charged in both the states of New Jersey and New York, and the charges just allowed to go away. So he's the sitting vice president of the United States charged with murder, and they just let the charges lapse.
Do you know who the U.S. attorney was who prosecuted him on the treason of Aaron Burr? Do you remember that?
Yes, so it was a fellow by the name of Hay, who was a close friend of Thomas Jefferson. He was the U.S. attorney down there. The trouble was Burr had an outstanding defense team. Burr helped defend himself. Luther Brandy Bottle Martin, because he was a drunk, but he was a functioning alcoholic, was considered to be the finest trial attorney in the United States. He was part of the Burr defense team. Sir?
Are there 2 streets in Frankfort that need to be renamed? Your hero is misspelled.
Yes, it should be an I.
Wilkinson Boulevard should be Traitor Boulevard.
One of the things that I've learned in my short time here in Frankfurt, I can't point to anything that he did bad here to the people of Frankfurt. He was like an Elon Musk kind of business guy, okay, but he was doing it to benefit himself, but also to benefit other people here. That he went into business. I'm not aware he ever cheated any of the business people here. He was just a bad businessman, so they were losing money, but it wasn't because he was embezzling. Sir?
The Burr conspiracy. Was it a real conspiracy with a chance for happening, or was it all in Burr's mind?
Oh, he had a variety of important people that he sucked into doing this. 3 U.S. senators were engaged with him. John Adair from Tennessee, Jonathan Dayton, who was former Speaker of the House. These people were actively involved with Burr, but the trouble is he told different stories to different people, and I don't think all of them were aware of the other stories he was telling different people.
Well, I often thought it was like the Copperhead 1864 uprising that never happened. There was a great groundswell, supposedly all these people in favor of it. When push to shove came, nobody showed up.
Well, but they did throw Vladingham out, right? He was forced to, as a copperhead, he was forced to go south. But you're right, he was never tried. Sir?
Yes, sir. When he was trying to set up the monopoly for trade with Spain down the Mississippi River, we were part of Virginia at that time. So what possible pressures or actions of our statehood could be related back to his push for trade from the Kentucky area? Or would there be any?
At the time, there were 10 different conventions as Kentucky was trying to figure out what were they going to do. And Wilkinson was actively advocating at those conventions, we need to go with Spain. Okay, so I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, yeah, because we declared statehood in 92.
Yes, 1792 is when Kentucky became a Commonwealth.
It was just a short time before that happened.
Yes.
You know, possibly that could have created some groundswell or general desire to obtain statehood so that we could trade independently.
Well, I mean, and clearly, I don't think there was ever any serious consideration, from what I've read, of staying with Virginia. You know, although that was one of the options. The people of Kentucky were tired of Richmond, and they clearly wanted to go somewhere else. And so the concern was, how far outside the orbit of the United States would Kentucky go? And that was the essence of the Spanish conspiracy. Was one of the options is, or two of the options was join Spain. And so a number of the founding fathers of the Commonwealth at least entertained. Now, whether they seriously entertained that or they are using that to leverage people to, hey, we need to become our own state. Otherwise, we'll be plucked by the Spanish. It's not clear.
I got one more.
Sure.
He was so motivated by money. How did he wind up at the end? What was his financial state?
It was bad. He had left his plantation down in New Orleans to be run by his son, but he never was able to make a go of running the plantation down there. So it might have made money when he left and his son ran it, but while he was running it, he wasn't making any money at all.
Well, he took in a lot of money. What did he do? Just spend the rest?
He just spent it and made poor business decisions. Okay. No. Okay, so when the Louisiana Purchase was finalized, there were letters there from the French ministers saying, we don't understand how this guy got where he does. He's drunk most of the time. He doesn't speak a word of Spanish and a word of French. So the answer on that is no. He never felt he needed to learn. Yeah, he obviously had translators that would work through it. And that's one of the nice things about it is that those letters have all been preserved by the Spanish. And so the Philson Society in Louisville has got a marvelous record of the translated communications, as does the Library of Congress.
All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mr. Cox.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming here. We have the capital of the Kentucky, which is Frankfort's first comprehensive history.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for coming here. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate the invitation. It's been a wonderful time. Thank you.